This is the Tombigbee Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi along the Tombigbee River called Columbus. And sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is about the area on the other side of the river called the Black Belt Prairie. Black Belt Prairie extends from just north of Columbus down into the rest of Lowndes County, Noxubee County, and over into Alabama, and it borders both sides of the Tombigbee River. The Black Belt Prairie passes through east central Mississippi, crossing Chickasaw, Clay, Lowndes, Monroe, Noxubee, and Oktibbeha counties. This vast sweep of native grasslands is named for its rich, dark soil that the Choctaw and later white farmers found perfect for farming corn and cotton, and then soybeans. As the territory began to form into cohesive communities, cotton growers left their depleted farms in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia and created massive plantation properties here in Mississippi. Their labor-intensive cotton crops brought with it large workforces of enslaved people. Cotton was moved to Mobile when the Tombigbee River was at flood stage until eventually a railroad was built to the wealthy towns of Columbus, Macon, Brooksville, Artesia, and Aberdeen. Incredible amounts of wealth were generated from the brutal practice of slavery. As the farms were expanded, more and more labor was required. The black population in this area at the beginning of the Civil War was almost double that of the white population. After the Civil War, many of the enslaved men and women of the prairie remained on the land working for shares. Tenant farming and sharecropping became a way of life for the rural population. They began to form small communities where they gathered to worship and play as Reconstruction began. Schools sprang up in these small communities on the edges of the large plantations. But as Reconstruction came to an end and Jim Crow laws took the place of federal protections for the African American population, white resistance to Black progress grew. White citizen councils used intimidation and strong-arm tactics to prevent the Black population that outnumbered the whites from voting. There were few jobs, as there were no factories or manufacturing, and only sharecropping. This led to an even tighter-knit Black community that sought refuge from their oppressive lives in play and prayer. Many of the brightest and strongest left to join the Great Migration north to St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit in hopes of jobs and future greater opportunity. It was in this Black Belt Prairie impoverished environment that many great blues musicians rose to prominence. It was in this same environment that one of the earliest and little-known Noxubee County musicians, Elijah Brown, was born in 1896, somewhere near Brooksville. There is not much written about Brown, but his life can be traced via census records and draft records. He served in the Army during World War I, first with the 164th Depot Brigade, and later was transferred to Company G of the 814th Infantry. He mustered out as a private. By 1930, he had left Mississippi and is living in East St. Louis, Missouri. By the 1940 census, he is living in East St. Louis and working as a hottie, a bricklayer's brick carrier. In 1948, he's shown to have joined ranks with Big Joe Williams, another Mississippian, to record Ramblin' on My Mind. Nothing else is found on his music or life until at the age of 70, Brown did another recording session on March 12, 1965, for then recording engineer Big Joe, and several songs were recorded and then published on multiple anthologies. His work at that session, with a phrasing style reminiscent of Delta blues legend Charlie Patton, included Crying Won't Make Me Stay, Pearline, Winding Ball, John Henry, and Which Way Does the River Flow? After that, Brown disappears into obscurity before his death in 1979. He is buried in St. Louis at the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. Big Joe Williams was born in 1903, just a few miles away from Elijah Brown near Crawford, Mississippi. Known for his nine-string guitar, Williams got his start busking in front of stores, alleys, bars, and work camps. In 1920, he played in the Rabbit Foot Minstrels Revue, and by 1930, he recorded with the Birmingham Jug Band for OK Records. He played with picks on his thumbs and index fingers, with a lit cigarette smashed between his second and third fingers, the haze obscuring his large round face. Joe also played with a kazoo wired around his neck. He would play with Sonny Boy Williamson and allegedly was married to St. Louis blues singer Bessie Mae Smith for a short period. Big Joe is credited with taking 15-year-old Muddy Waters out of Rolling Fork and on the road with him. Waters was allegedly so sweet on his harps and such a smooth talker with the women that Joe felt compelled to move on solo again. Joe was popular in Europe and Japan and toured there often when not in the U.S., playing juke joints, bars, and supper clubs. Williams is credited with influencing Bob Dylan to begin recording his own music rather than just covers. The two would eventually record a duet with Spivey Records. Joe Williams is credited with many songs, but his most noted are Baby Please Don't Go, Crawling King Snake, and Peach Orchard Mama. Joe died in 1982 and is buried in a pasture in Oktibbeha County near his hometown of Crawford, Mississippi, just over the Lowndes County line. A large headstone was erected by the Mount Zion Memorial Fund to commemorate his life and his blues contributions. Big Joe Williams' cousin, John Wesley Macon, was born in 1923 in Crawford, Mississippi. Macon, also known as Mr. Short Stuff, was 20 years younger than Williams and first recorded with his cousin, Joe, and Gary Davis up north in 1964. No one wanted to hear his field holler stylings and country blues in the heart of the folk revolution at the coffee houses and pubs. Blues aficionados loved them, as did colleges. However, due to his illiteracy, the ability to book gigs for him was limited. Disappointed in the trip and the lack of success in New York and Chicago, he would return home to play locally until his death in 1973. Mr. Shortstuff, Joe Wesley Macon, died in Macon, Mississippi in 1973 and is buried in Sesam's Lebanon Methodist Cemetery in Oktibbeha County, Mississippi. Booker T. Washington White, or Booker White, was born in 1909 in Chickasaw County, Mississippi, between Houston and Aberdeen, in the community of Sparta on the Willie Harrington Farm. Chickasaw County has delivered its fair share of blues and gospel artists, including Cleve and Clay Graham of the Pilgrim Jubilees, Otho Lee Gaines of the Delta Rhythm Boys, Mylon Williams of the Commodores, Willie Buck, C.D. Dobbs, and country blues singer and songwriter Bobby Gentry. White was the son of a fiddle player who also was known to play mandolin and guitar for parties and events when not working on the railroad. His cousin on his mother's side was blues legend B.B. King. His mother and King's grandmother were sisters. White got his first guitar at age 9 from his father, and he began to play guitar, fiddle, and some piano at local dances. By age 16, he was married and got a brand new Stella from his father for a wedding gift. He was not married long before he was widowed when his wife's appendix burst. White, heartbroken, decided to move to the Delta. He was an ardent fan of Charlie Patton, so he decided to move to Swan Lake in Tallahatchie County near Glendora to work and hopefully play with area musicians. While there, he was scouted by Ralph Limbo, who took him to Memphis in 1930 for White's first recording session with Victor Records. This relationship resulted in 2 records that were a mix of country blues and gospel under the name of Washington White. In 1934, White married his second wife, Susie Simpson, and moved back home near Aberdeen and returned to farming. Sometime between 1935 and 1938, he went to Chicago via St. Louis and recorded several tracks, including Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and Shake 'em Down. In 1937, White was arrested in Aberdeen and convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life at the Mississippi Penitentiary, Parchman Farm. Cultural anthropologist John Lomax visited White there and convinced him to record Po' Boy and Sick'em Dogs for his project. Fortunately, White's sentence was commuted and he was relieved after serving only 2 years of his sentence. In 1940, White moved to Chicago and recorded Parchman Farm Blues. As World War II began to grip the world, White served in the Navy from 1942 to 1944. After that, he moved to Memphis to work in a tank factory instead of the music industry. He remained in Memphis until the folk revolution of the 1960s when John Fay rediscovered White and recorded a new album with him on Fay's Tacoma record label. It was during this time that Bob Dylan recorded White's Fixin' to Die. British rock band Led Zeppelin was heavily influenced by White's Shake 'Em Down. White lived the rest of his life in Memphis, where he and his wife were known in their community lovingly as Big Daddy and Little Mama. Booker T. Washington White died of cancer in 1977 in Memphis and is buried there in the New Park Cemetery. He was finally inducted in the Blues Hall of Fame in 1990. Chester Arthur Burnett, better known as Howlin' Wolf, was born in 1910 in White Station, a tiny crossroads just north of West Point in Clay County, Mississippi, on the Black Belt Prairie. His parents separated and his mother returned to her parents with Chester. At age 13, Chester's mother sent him to live with her brother, a strict and pious man. Chester ran away to his dad's house to live. His father, Doc, would then give him his first guitar. He is said to have played with greats like Charlie Patton, Sonny Boy Williamson, who was married to Chester's sister Maggie, Robert Johnson, Johnny Shines, Honey Boy Edwards, Son House, and Willie Brown. In 1941, Chester was drafted into the Army and he served in the 9th Cavalry for almost 3 years before being discharged for an alleged nervous breakdown. After the Army, he returned to the Delta until 1948 when he moved to West Memphis, Arkansas. In 1952, he moved to Chicago to join Chess Records and to meet with fellow Mississippian Muddy Waters, with whom he developed a rivalry. Chester was functionally illiterate. He decided to change this and earned not only his GED, but then studied business and accounting. He used his knowledge to build not only his own financial future, but to care for his team ethically. He maintained a payroll, withheld Social Security and employment insurance, and provided health insurance for his team as well. He personally lived a modest life with his wife Lily and her 2 daughters. Chester suffered from acute kidney and heart disease in the last years of his life. His last live performance was in 1975 at the Chicago Amphitheater with B.B. King and Albert King. He collapsed right after he left the stage. He would suffer with his maladies and finally die in 1976 in Hines, Illinois, and is buried at Oak Ridge Glen Oak Cemetery. Brother Joe May was born in 1912 near Macon, Mississippi. May grew up singing in churches around Noxubee County. He began to tour on the Southern gospel circuit and grew to be known as the greatest male gospel soloist. He was heavily influenced by local blues singer and Bessie Smith. In 1941, May, his wife Viola, and their children moved to East St. Louis, where May worked in a chemical plant. While in St. Louis, he met Willie Mae Ford Smith, who became a mentor and great influence on his future success. She invited him to sing at the national conventions of gospel choirs. By 1949, he was signed by a talent scout, and his first record, Search Me, Lord, sold 1 million+ copies. This led to recording Do You Know Him, a duet with Smith, in 1950. The record company encouraged him to record secular music as well, but he declined. In the 1960s, May was so popular that he was touring the U.S., Europe with Marianne Williams after their success in New York City with their performance of the Black Nativity. He went on to perform with Mahalia Jackson and the Soul Stirrers and Pilgrim Travelers. In 1972, Joe May was on his way to Thomasville, Georgia for a performance when he suffered a massive stroke at the age of 59. He is buried at Sunset Gardens of Memory in Millstadt, Illinois. Robert Earl Blair was born in Cliftonville, a rural Black community in Noxubee County, Mississippi, in 1927. Blair sang at church and was recognized early as having a mellow tenor voice. His parents moved with their children to Detroit in the 1940s in search of opportunity and better jobs. Blair served in the Army from 1948 to 1952. During that time, he married his wife Adele in Detroit. Blair began singing with the Fantastic Violinaires, a gospel quartet. He was known for his high tenor and his theatrical falsetto voice. While with the Violinaires, he recorded Stand By Me with Checker Records in 1965. Before his death in 2001 of a heart attack, he had recorded over 30 albums. This leads us to another Noxubee County family, the Harrington family legacy. Houston Harrington was born in Noxubee County in 1924. He was a fiddler, a minister, and an inventor. His invention of a recording device was what launched him to found Atomic H Records and for his sons to later found the Atomic Blues Band. Houston was married to Hilda Spiller, whose father, uncle, and nephew were also musicians. Perry Spiller, Preston Spiller, and Doc Spiller formed a string band called the Salt and Pepper Shakers. They are considered the founding fathers of the Prairie Blues in Noxubee County. They played all the local white and Black social events in Noxubee and Lowndes counties that required musical entertainment, quote, fit to dance to. Hilda's husband, Houston, would often accompany them on his fiddle. Houston and family moved to the west side of Chicago in the early 1940s, and he launched their Atomic H label. In the 1950s, they recorded blues and gospel records with a modicum of success. Their sons, Joe and Vernon Harrington, formed the Atomic Blues Band in 1970 and played venues around Chicago, at times backing their cousin from Macon, Eddie Clearwater. Houston died in 1972 in Chicago and is buried in Mount Glenwood Memory Garden in Willow Springs, Illinois. His wife eventually remarried to Alfred Ray, the father of music legend Freddie King. Houston's nephew, Eddie Clearwater, the Chief Harrington, was born in Macon in 1935. He was raised by his grandparents after the death of his mother. Eddie was a lefty and learned to play on a right-handed guitar turned upside down. At age 13, his grandparents moved to Birmingham to be closer to his uncle. There he attended church and played guitar for the Five Blind Boys of Alabama. In 1950, his uncle Houston invited him to Chicago. It was there his uncle purchased him a Silvertone electric guitar and an amp. His first gig in Chicago with the setup was with Little Max Simmons. Eddie then went on to form Eddie and the Cutaways. His agent, Jump Jackson, renamed him Clearwaters. His first hit was Hillbilly Blues in 1958. He had a few recordings made after that, but they mostly dried up by 1966. He then devoted his time to playing anywhere he could find a paying audience for his flamboyant performances. Eddie died in Chicago in 2018 and is buried in the New Light Cemetery in Skokie, Illinois. In 2016, he was inducted in the Blues Hall of Fame in Memphis. Eddie's distant cousin, Carrie Bell Harrington, was born in Macon in 1936. As a child, he wanted to play saxophone, but his family had little money. His grandfather gave him a harmonica when he was about 8. By age 13, he was playing professionally at house parties and events with bluesman Lovey Lee. In 1956, Lee and Bell moved to Chicago and played with the Swinging Cats. There, Bell met Little Walter, and they became friends. By the 1960s, harp had fallen out of favor in music, So Bell took up the bass and played under Hound Dog Taylor, Honey Boy Edwards, Johnny Young, Eddie Taylor, Earl Hooker, and Big Walter. By 1969, Bell was back to playing harp, and with the help of Charlie Musselwhite, he was signed with Delmark Records. He toured with Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon and other greats until his death in 2007 in Chicago. He was inducted in the Blues Hall of Fame in 2023. Willie King was born on a plantation in Prairie Grove, Noxubee County, in 1943 when the U.S. was deep into war in Japan and apartheid was at its apex in Mississippi. King was raised by his sharecropper grandparents. His absent father was an aspiring blues musician who was too busy chasing his own dreams to claim his son Willie. King's maternal grandfather was a gospel singer, and his grandmother owned a juke joint. King first learned to play a diddley bow that was nailed to a tree. He got his first guitar when he was 9. When he was 24, he left home and moved to Chicago to try and break into the blues scene there. He only lasted a year as he felt the tug of home, the early civil rights movement, and the local music scene. He moved to Old Memphis, a small rural black community on the Mississippi-Alabama line in Noxubee County, just a few miles down the road from his childhood home. There he took a job as a traveling salesman, refusing to assume the yoke of sharecropping, and joined the local civil rights movement. While there, he played with local blues bands, including the Pipe Layers, Horse Rockers, and his band, the Liberators. Many of the local young and upcoming blues artists cycled in and out of the bands, including Willie James Williams, Willie Lee Halbert, and Johnny B. Smith. It was during this time that Willie King began to craft songs of protest and struggle and made a name for himself locally, as well as some notice nationally from grassroots social justice groups. Willie King's music became the music of the civil rights movement. His music was called struggle blues, and he used his voice to build community all through the 70s and 80s. His lyrics described the life of those terrorized down on the farm and described the lynchings and castrations that permeated the area into the 1980s. In 1981, King formally established the Rural Members Association, the RMA, in Old Memphis, Alabama. He recruited blues, gospel, and R&B artists to join his efforts to host events to raise money to alleviate social and economic issues in that profoundly poor section of the prairie. For the next 20 years, King fought to alleviate the crushing poverty and social issues of his community, Old Mexico, Bigby Valley, Sandyland, and in Prairie Point. King single-handedly promoted the cultural survival of his community through education, music, community service, and activism. King played every Sunday at Betty's Place in Sandyland with the Liberators and organized festivals and performances to bring in people from surrounding communities. King was known to claim, quote, "You gotta play till their feet start itching to dance, and you can't quit until they're ready to let go of their troubles." With the proceeds of the festivals and events he held, King was able to support community efforts to teach youth blues, gospel, quilting, large-scale subsistence gardens, food preservation, woodworking, and housing renovation. To divide the distance between the older generation and the younger ones, RMA used the younger members to introduce digital literacy to their elders. He taught them to capture the oral history of their elders. Through the blues, King and the RMA demonstrated the power behind the blues in community building and community advocacy. His last concert was held in Columbus, Mississippi on March 7th, 2009. He died the next day, on his birthday, in Noxubee County, leaving behind his wife, Mary Coleman King, and 2 daughters. King is buried at Spring Hill Baptist in Prairie Point, Mississippi. In his lifetime, Willie King was a W.C. Handy Award winner for his music lyrics. He was featured in Martin Scorsese's documentary series The Blues in 2003. King was posthumously inducted in the Black Belt Prairie Hall of Fame in 2012. A contemporary of Willie King, Jesse Fortune, was born in Noxubee County in 1930. He began his singing career in church singing gospels as a small child. He went to school to be a barber and worked as a barber by day and a blues singer by night. At the age of 22, Jesse moved to Chicago to pursue singing. But just like back home in Mississippi, he kept his day job and his circle of loyal customers as a barber. Early in his career, he worked with Otis Rush, Buddy Guy, and Willie Dixon, where his vocal style was compared to B.B. King's gospel and grit. He recorded Too Many Cooks, Dark as the Night, Sandy, Ain't About the Money, and among others. He never made any money from his recordings, so he grew rapidly disillusioned with the music business. He left the music industry and returned to barbering full-time on the west side of Chicago. In 1992, he returned to performing on the stage and in clubs to great acclaim. He turned down touring abroad so he would not disappoint his barbering customers. He gave his final performance in 2009 at Gene's Playmate Lounge, where he collapsed on the stage. He died at Mount Sinai Hospital in Chicago and is buried there in Mount Hope Cemetery. As you can see, so many blues greats have come from the Black Belt Prairie as well as from the west side of the state in the Delta. While these fellows are not as well known, perhaps, in the music world as some of the greats who came from the Mississippi Delta, the Black Belt Prairie Blues have played a significant part in influencing the music of the future that became rock and roll, as well as much of today's music. Thank you for coming on my tour of Mississippi and the Black Belt Prairie and the Tom Bigby Tales. Until next time.